I want to thank all of you come out on a fairly dismal day for this talk. Dismal days sort of always seem to fit with the Middle East. Today's headlines, of course, have us between sort of open mic problems and American and French attitudes toward the Israeli Prime Minister to the IAEA report on Iranian nuclear programs. Never a lot of good news out of the Middle East. So, okay, I want to first of all say thank you to Bill Longwell for in many ways giving me a much easier task in the next two lectures. I'm not an area specialist, and it was really wonderful to have him lay out the longer-term history in this region. I'm mostly a 20th century historian, so that was really very helpful for me, and I think sets up a background for us to continue to discuss the issues of the Arab Spring. I also want to thank Sam McSeveny for inviting me here. Sam, if you like anything about this program, and that, say thanks to Sam. I can't say no to anything Sam has asked me ever to do. Sam hired me, was my first chair when I got to Vanderbilt. I probably have him up on a pedestal with the people I most admire in the world, and he's out there, and it'd be hard for me ever to turn him down. And he has made this program, I think his commitment to education, ongoing education is extraordinary, and he's, I think, been a driving force in making sure we have good courses. Let me start off with something like a little bit of a buyer's beware. Unlike Bill, I didn't start out to study the Middle East. In fact, I almost consciously avoided trying to study anything to do with the Middle East. I'm a historian of U.S. foreign relations, but my emphasis was always on the U.S. and Europe. My other language skills, limited as they are, were in German, and I was always interested more in, you might say, the legacy of World War II and the post-war European settlement than I was in anything to do with the Middle East. I got to Vanderbilt about 20 years ago. At the same time, Saddam Hussein decided to invade Kuwait, and I was the foreign policy person. So I suddenly became an expert, but it made me realize how loosely the term expert is used by American culture. And I started doing interviews, and I fancied myself as knowing something, but I really knew that this was not my field, and thankfully the Gulf War was over quickly. My fame was over, 15 minutes was done, and I retreated to my U.S.-European issues, which has been my specialty. I started in on the Middle East, and in this way I think I'm a lot like other Americans. I used to get called up for comment on foreign policy issues, but on September 11th, 2001, I was in my office having dropped my daughter off at kindergarten that day, and I got a call from Anne Marie Owens to ask me my reaction to 9/11. Well, by the time I turned on the news and saw what she was talking about, I had to come back and say, I don't know. I'm for once in my life, I'm without words. And that is really for once in my life. I'm rarely without words. So in a way, that was the beginning of my own intellectual efforts to understand better the United States and the Middle East. A couple of years later, I had the privilege of teaching a Humanities 161 class, which is a group-taught course where I was on the U.S. and the Middle East. We were doing this at the time of the build-up to the Iraq War, and that itself was a fascinating exercise in having speakers come in and talk and discuss the issues. It probably would, some of you may know Paul Konkin in here, one of the other great figures in my department, but he came into that course and was giving a talk on sort of background in U.S. history, and I remember him saying, "We will regret invading Iraq." And at the time, the students were much more gung-ho than he was, and I hesitate to tell Paul he was right, since he usually is right, but he was certainly about that. But we taught that course. Vanderbilt at that time, also in the early part of the last decade, was developing Jewish studies, and Jewish studies asked me to develop a course on the U.S. and the Middle East. And over the last few years, that's been my attempt to do so. I was able finally to visit the region, visit Israel in 2005. So slowly but surely, I've developed some knowledge about the region. But I offer this as a buyer's beware because it comes from the filter of someone who's interested more in American foreign policy and to the issues that drive that than necessarily knowledge of the region. But I will do my best here today to talk about some of the history. I'm trying to think, do I? No, for whatever reason, I've got the wrong. Well, let me start out with a quotation. It's one of my favorite quotations in history. I didn't put it up there initially. I was trying to cut down the number of slides, and so I chopped this one out. It's the challenge of thinking about history. And the British historian C.V. Wedgwood once wrote, "History is lived forwards, but it is written in retrospect. We know the end before we consider the beginning, and we can never wholly recapture what it was to know the beginning only." I love that quote because I think it does capture, in a way, some of what I seek to do with my students, trying to give them a sense of how the uncertainties, how situations look to people at that time. It's so easy at times to look back on the past and consider ourselves superior to the ignorant troglodytes before us. When we, in fact, actually look and put ourselves in their shoes and think about the dilemmas they face, the issues they face, I think we get a different sense and understanding of history. And in a way, I'm going to be doing that a little bit today as we go back in time to talk about the history of American foreign relations during the Cold War and the way in which the Middle East comes into play. I'm simplifying it immediately with this three pillars notion. In thinking about American relations with the Middle East during the Cold War, there are three essential things to remember. One is that the Cold War, the contest with the Soviet Union, the sense of a global struggle that a former Vanderbilt professor, Melvin Leffler, calls in a book he wrote, The Struggle for the Soul of Mankind, that overshadowed everything. Even if it was not always the key factor, it was overshadowing all other issues. And it has to at least be recalled. And this is, as you might guess, when I'm getting up and lecturing Vanderbilt students now who were born the year the Cold War ended. This is something that's hard for them to recapture. It's hard for them to get a sense of how perilous the world looked, how different the world looked during the Cold War. It's for them probably the same as what it was like when professors would get up and tell me what the image of Nazi Germany was before World War II. It's distant for them. The second point is support for Israel's security, and eventually Israel as a strategic asset. The relationship between the United States and Israel has evolved over the years, but I think it's important to recall that almost from the very beginning, there was a powerful political, cultural affinity for the struggle of the Jewish people to regain a homeland in the Middle East, in Palestine. We can argue all day about the justice or injustice of that, but I'm just going to say that right there. And one has to keep in mind that American foreign policy is not, as the person who I'm writing about, Henry Kissinger, sometimes pictured it, a geopolitical abstraction. It is deeply ingrained and deeply responsive to the political impulses of the American people and to their views and values. And in this, the relationship with Israel, as it developed and grew over the years, became exceedingly close. And it has created all sorts of issues and problems for the United States, but it's also been an exceptionally successful alliance in many other respects. So that as well. And I'll try to get to some degree talking about how it's evolved over the years of the Cold War. And the third, that oil. And the oil issue only came to prominence in Americans' consciousness in the 1970s with the Arab oil boycott after the Yom Kippur War. But it was always there. Oil, for example, fueled the European recovery. Lots of Marshall Plan dollars were spent on Middle Eastern oil to get Europe's economy going again. So Europe was often the beneficiary, but oil was always an issue. And even if oil directly was not the question, denying that oil to the Soviet Union, a recognition of how central it was for modern economies, for modern societies, was always there. So this was always, these three things sometimes in contradiction to each other, sometimes in tension. But these three are three, I think, that are really important to remember and think about. This is, of course, a classic picture from Franklin Roosevelt coming back from Yalta in 1945. The other night, I think Mary Pat might be here, I don't know if she is, but they had a speech at the UN. The local group brought in Thomas Lipman, who's an expert on Saudi Arabia. I think that talk was announced. He wrote an article about this meeting, which is absolutely both funny, because it talks about how they had to arrange for the Saudi king with his enormous entourage and all the animals, wives, attendants, servants he brought to bring him to meet with Franklin Roosevelt on a battleship in the Mediterranean. It was quite an endeavor to do it. And the Saudis all wanted to sleep out on deck because they didn't want something to do with not wanting to be inside the ship. And it was just this extraordinary moment that is legendary in U.S.-Saudi relations. It's also legendary for a number of other things. Many of you probably are far more familiar than many of my students with some of the issues around Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt, a remarkable man, extraordinary president. He's also someone who could often say many different things to many different people, as some of you know. In the meeting with Ibn Saud, which was the beginning, you might say, of the idea of a U.S.-Saudi alliance, which to this day is, of course, an important part of the region, Roosevelt did suggest to Ibn Saud that about the possibility of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The king was deeply negative about it, saying the Jews should simply go back to Europe. That's where they were, and you've destroyed their enemies, so they should go back there. Roosevelt kept coming back to the issue in the conversation. Finally, Roosevelt would give, though, after he wrote the king after the end of the conversation, replying to the king, saying that he wished to assure His Majesty, quote, that he would do nothing to assist the Jews against the Arabs and would make no more move hostile to the Arab people, and that his government would make no change in its basic policy in Palestine without full and prior consultation of both Jews and Arabs. When he returned to Washington, he told Congress, quote, on the problem of Arabia, I learned more about that whole problem, the Muslim problem, the Jewish problem, by talking with Ibn Saud for 5 minutes than I could have learned in the exchange of 2 or 3 dozen letters. But as usual, he didn't specify what he had learned. And in fact, as one of his senior aides observed sarcastically, the only thing he learned was what everyone already knew, that the Arabs didn't want any more Jews in Palestine, which is indeed there. And indeed, that moment is sometimes thought to be a beginning of a relationship that would be soured, of course, by the change in policy that would take place. Of course, Franklin Roosevelt dies before any of this could be established. Sometimes I think there's a parallel here between the same way in which Roosevelt was uncertain about what to do about Indochina, French Indochina, and left the issue up in the air for his successor, leading to many tragic results later there. He left this issue up in the air for his successor. But of course, also the international system changed. And the initial crises, and this is, I think, important to simply have you aware of, is that the initial crises of the Cold War, the ones that began the process of mobilizing the idea that the United States would have to break from what had been the grand alliance of the U.S., Britain, and the Soviets to a sort of position of containment and opposition, came because of fears of the Soviet Union's expansionist tendencies in the Eastern Mediterranean. First in Iran, where the Soviets did not withdraw when they said they would at the end of the war, and seemed to be fueling a secessionist movement in northern Azerbaijan. Then in Turkey, where the Soviets sent notes to the Turks demanding certain territorial concessions in eastern Turkey, as well as changes in the ways in which the Dardanelles were governed. And then in Greece, where a civil war raged. Amazing to think Greece has played such a big role in so many things these days. But in this particular case, the civil war in Greece also created this situation in which the United States began to see the Soviet Union less as a former ally, or less as an ally, and more as a potential adversary. The other point to recall on this is that in many respects, the early Cold War, much as we think of it in terms of the United States against the Soviet Union, also had to do with the decline of Great Britain. Franklin Roosevelt, to a large extent, thought that the American role after World War II might be mediating between Britain and the Soviet Union. That would not be the case. The decline in British power was rapid, and in particular, the Eastern Mediterranean, where they had been the dominant power, was where that decline really forced the United States to make a choice of whether to enter into the vacuum that would be created by a British withdrawal, by the British inability to continue being the power in the region. And so much of what we think about in terms of the Middle East is really as much the result of the decline of European power as it is the United States' assertion into the region. It's both and the same. Okay. By 1947, of course, you do have the Truman Doctrine. The doctrine itself is worth quoting simply because it does frame American foreign policy for a long period of time. This idea that it must be the United States' policy to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. That doctrine would be modified slightly. Every president loves to have a doctrine. It's a part of the American ritual. I think it sometimes gets into the ways in which our civic religion has tendencies like a regular religion, but presidents have to have doctrines. So Truman had his. Eisenhower would modify this for the Middle East. We'll come to that a little later. But containment goes into full force in 1947-48. The centerpiece of the Cold War shifts from, you might say, the Near East, what was called then the Near East, into Central Europe, in particular, of course, into the situation of divided Germany, and particularly the collision of the powers in Berlin. I raise this because the issues revolving around Harry Truman and Israel take place at the same time in which Truman is making choices about the Cold War in Europe. In a way, they're part and parcel, less prominent, but still out there. But he's making choices dealing with the issues in Europe at the same time as he's confronting them in Palestine. In contrast, you might say, to the degree to which the American government comes together about Cold War issues, it is deeply divided over the issues of Israel and the question of a recognition of a Jewish state. You might say the permanent American government, the State Department, the Defense Department, all the sort of apparatus of that government that existed at that time, opposed any recognition or support for a Jewish state. They made the calculation, quite obvious in some ways, that there are a lot more Arabs than there are Jews, and that the United States would need to maintain good relations with much of the Arab world if it was in this struggle with the Soviet Union, and that, for that matter, this would be in the interests of the national security of the United States to remain aloof from the issues of Palestine. The other side of the coin was politics, and certainly also, I think, some of this cultural and other issues. I put up on there a picture of Clark Clifford, one of the handsomest men, actually, to ever be a sort of political advisor, looking a lot like Ralph Bellamy, the actor Ralph Bellamy. Clifford was Truman's political advisor from Missouri. Clifford was concerned with getting the president reelected. And Clifford favored recognition of Israel, as did many of Truman's friends. There is, of course, a sentimental story about this man, Eddie Jacobson. Eddie Jacobson was a tailor, and Eddie Jacobson and Harry Truman went into business as tailors in Kansas City. They failed in the 1920s, went bankrupt. Both of them spent ages paying back their debts. Jacobson came in and got access to Truman as a friend, lobbied for the Zionist position, as did, and got Truman to see many of the Zionists who made the case for American recognition. I bring this up because last year a prospective Vanderbilt student and his family came to visit Vanderbilt, and they asked if they could meet with a professor, and I happened to be around and said sure, and they came in and got to talking, and they were from Missouri and Kansas City, and they noticed I had a picture of Truman in my office, and we got to talking about that, and he mentioned that he knew he had actually had a memento, and in fact, this is a hanger from the Eddie Jacobson Taylor Company, which I still keep as a prized possession. They came up with it for me. Now, the sad thing is I didn't get his kid into Vanderbilt, but that's another story. Vanderbilt is a lot harder to get into, and they don't listen to faculty when we try to lobby them for special interest. But Jacobson was a part of this. In any case, eventually Truman comes down and decides for the de facto recognition of Israel. I think it is a mix of motives, but politics is never far from it. Even though politically, Truman does not carry New York. It's not, Dewey does carry it. In that sense, politically, it's less the question of carrying a specific state or Jewish Americans than the fact that it was widely popular for the United States to back Israel. It simply was. Congress, during the war, some 399 out of the 435 representatives at the time signed a petition in support of a Jewish state. It was widely popular for the United States to do so, and Truman does, much to the irritation of the British. And the irony is, of course, that as the United States is cooperating with Britain in terms of the Cold War, some awfully harsh messages are being exchanged between Clement Attlee, Ernest Bevin, and Harry Truman and George Marshall over the issues related to the recognition of Israel. The United States recognition of Israel, the UN Partition Plan was the initial method. Well, you've already seen this map. Israel ends up fighting a war beginning in 1948, of course, as it is comes into being. What's important to remember in terms of looking back on that is that the recognition of Israel actually was not a Cold War issue. The Soviet Union was the second state to recognize Israel. The United States and the Soviet Union on this agreed. In this sense, the initial situation and partition of Palestine, like in some ways the other partition of India at the time, partition was thought to be the only way in which you could solve these complicated political environments like India, these colonial relationships. It was the only way to solve it, and it was done. But it was not a Cold War issue. And in fact, Israel wins its war, not only with money from the United States, not directly Americans, but many Jewish Americans and other sympathizers send money to Israel, but it also gets arms from Czechoslovakia, a communist country at the time. So Israel's able to win in part because it's able to get support from both sides of the Cold War against the Arab states, and the Arab states also militarily are not as effective as Israel. It's outside of Jordan, which really did fight more effectively than the other states. Switch back to a broader profile. The United States, after the Korean War, mobilizes on a sort of worldwide and global basis to fight the Cold War. Curiously enough, Israel actually flirts with neutrality for a time. The Israelis actually don't vote for the resolution condemning the invasion by North Korea of South Korea. They abstain, and they try to avoid this. They're trying to, in some sense, try to play on this idea that they can be between the two powers. That doesn't last very long because Stalin very quickly begins to choose and decide that, especially as he neared the end of his life, he sort of sank into some anti-Semitic sort of hallucinations and started almost setting up a new pogrom in the Soviet Union. But for a time, Israel was trying to stay away from the Cold War, gradually moves into it. The region itself, though, is seen as crucial. And in 1953, the United States and Britain, showing that cooperative aspect, actually launched the CIA coup against Mohammed Mossadegh, who was seen as too close to the Iranian communists, seen as too willing to take support from the Iranian Communist Party. And Eisenhower gives approval to a covert operation that Truman actually, for a time, actually discouraged the British from pursuing. The British, in some ways, take more of a lead in the actual carrying out of the proposal, but it does succeed in overthrowing the Mossadegh government and putting the Shah back. And it's one of these cases in which you see how the Cold War begins to shape American policy in the region and the desire to have client states. Iran will go on to become one of the most significant American client states during the Cold War, up till 1979. The United States will not only have a close military relationship, it will have all sorts of bases in Iran to monitor the Soviet Union. Iran will be a sort of pillar in the region. And the loss of Iran will have a shattering effect on American strategy later in the Cold War. But the Iranian coup is a significant moment early in the Cold War. I had to bring in something I did long time ago. I wrote my first book on this man to the side, John McCloy, and his role in Germany after the war. One of the things that's not terrifically well known is that the Germans, as a part of their, you might say, requirement to re-enter the community of nations, paid enormous reparations for the crimes of World War II. John McCloy, with Konrad Adenauer, the chancellor, and Nahum Goldmann, a representative from sort of the world Jewish community, negotiated what was called the Luxembourg Treaty, 1952, which established a system of reparations and restitution. And over a time, billions of Deutschmarks would go to Israel and to citizens of Israel as a form of restitution from the war. And the German role in actually helping early Israel, and Israel was under tremendous economic strain in its early years in dealing with the large numbers of immigrants who came in, is not very well known, but was a significant role. And Germany actually played a role both in terms of financial aid to Israel, but also later in the 1960s, when the United States was still reluctant to sell certain types of weapons, the Germans sold the weapons to Israel for a time. And this is something I knew of through my work on the U.S. and Germany, but it's not terrifically well known, I think, otherwise. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to the Suez Crisis, which we've already talked about, and simply also put that in some context in the Cold War. Bill talked a lot about Gamal Abdel Nasser, the most significant pan-Arabist leader. What's important in this sense is to remember that the Suez Crisis, which comes about after Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal, and then the angry response of the British and French for different reasons, but in their hope then to conspire with Israel to overthrow Nasser, to try in a sense to retain their imperial presence in the Middle East. All of this is going on under the shadow, of course, of the Cold War. And many of you probably do remember, although it's one of these simultaneous events that's sometimes murky in people's memories, that the Suez Crisis is ongoing at the same time as Hungary is trying to free itself from domination of the Soviets in Eastern Europe. And in fact, the British-French invasion that takes place to try to overturn Nasser becomes a type of cover for Nikita Khrushchev to send in the tanks into Hungary in 1956. And in fact, one of the reasons why Eisenhower is so upset about the Suez Crisis, not for one because the British and French had not consulted him, but for another is it completely undermined the hope to emphasize what the Soviet Empire was doing in Eastern Europe. And in fact, what you got was, of course, the British and French doing it in another place. And so the Cold War implications were something that angered Eisenhower greatly. Khrushchev, of course, this is one of my, well, this is the typical Khrushchev speech because he's always angry, either pounding his shoe or whatever on the table. But he also threatens the British and French with nuclear annihilation if they don't get out of Suez. He actually does some missile rattling. And so the crises of 1956 seemed to demonstrate not only that European power was fading in the Middle East, that it could not do what it had once done, but that the United States would have to take new initiatives in the Middle East to restore its own Cold War standing and its own appeal. to Egypt and to the other nations of the region. And in fact, Eisenhower does force the British and French and the Israelis to withdraw. And the result is, of course, the famous Eisenhower Doctrine of 1957, which argues that assistance and cooperation will include the employment of the armed forces of the United States to secure and protect territorial integrity and political independence of such nations requesting such aid against overt armed aggression from any nation controlled by international communism. A revision a little bit of the Truman Doctrine, but designed, of course, to deal with what was seen as the new Middle East, the Middle East in which the United States now would be taking a far more fundamental role in trying to prevent Soviet initiatives. The Soviet Union had changed very much its policy that had begun under Stalin and now was courting, and Khrushchev aggressively courted the leaders of the new Middle East, establishing relationships with Syria, with Egypt, and Gamal Abdel Nasser as one of the key figures in that. Eisenhower's doctrine, of course, is employed a year later when the pro-British, pro-Western government of Iraq is overthrown, and there's worries that something similar will happen in Lebanon. Eisenhower sends in the Marines to Lebanon in what is a relatively peaceful, there's no actual shooting, it's a sort of show of force, trying to stabilize the Lebanese government. But the United States is now taking a far more active interest in the Middle East in the late 1950s. I'm never going to get through all of this, so I'm going to my promise is, if I don't get through it today, I will. I do have one more. So I had up here Kennedy, Johnson, and Israel. And one of the reasons I put this up is actually the Kennedy and Johnson years are not normally associated very much with Israel, except until you get to the Six-Day War in 1967. And there's good reason for that. Because in many respects, the political conflicts of the Middle East receded in their importance in the United States as other things took far greater precedence. Berlin, Cuba, Vietnam. And for a time, the Middle East was not a particularly strong area of American interest or concern. Kennedy, though, wanted to warm relations both with Israel and with Egypt. Kennedy came into power feeling that Eisenhower's "you're either with us or against us" policy, his anti-neutralism policy under John Foster Dulles, the famous Secretary of State, had been alienating to countries that might be more sympathetic. And Kennedy started a deliberate program to try to court Nasser as well as warm relations with Israel. He felt he could do both. In many respects, he had a faith in his own personal charm that I think our current president that in some ways had. He believed that he could span this divide. So the United States provided more additional food aid, other positions for Egypt. Kennedy began I hope that's not my microphone. Kennedy began a correspondence with Nasser, trying to sort out issues at the same time as you see him meeting here with Ben-Gurion and also dealing with the Israelis. Now, one of the issues that really caused problems between the United States and Israel during this time was nuclear proliferation. The United States knew that the Israelis were working on a nuclear bomb and wanted to convince them to abandon the program. They didn't get very far on that. The United States also wanted to work with Egypt, but in late 1962, early 63, Nasser decided, after a coup in the country of Yemen, to send in Egyptian forces to try to support those who were trying to overthrow a pro-Western government. The Saudis were providing assistance to the others. The Yemen war of that time is not terrifically well known, but it soured relations between Kennedy and Nasser. And by the time Kennedy died, he was considerably more pessimistic about dealing with Nasser and dealing with the Egyptians in the Middle East. Lyndon Johnson had none of Kennedy's great interest in being even-handed. Johnson was far more sympathetic to Israel. He didn't want to put the United States out front on some of these issues. So, for example, he did get his friend Ludwig Erhard, the German chancellor, to provide tanks to the Israelis in 1965. He also provided assistance to Jordan, which he saw as a pro-Western government in the region. But relations with Nasser soured as Nasser both criticized American imperialism in Vietnam and American actions there, and also criticized Johnson more vehemently. My friend Robert Johnson has actually done a good book on this subject, Lyndon Johnson and Israel, The Secret Presidential Recordings, where he's actually also listened in on Johnson's tapes on Israel. There's not a great deal, not as much as you would think, in the taping system on Israel, but there's some interesting conversations, and I think it shows Johnson's own interest both in Israel, but also in the politics of supporting Israel too, as well, and Johnson certainly had that up through the Six-Day War. On to the Six-Day War. Remember that the crisis in Egypt in 1967 took place at a time in which the United States had almost 400,000 men in Southeast Asia. Nasser's expulsion of the UN observers in the region, his closing of the Gulf of Aqaba, triggered all sorts of Israeli fears and security concerns. One thing that might have helped might have been an American security guarantee to Israel. But as someone said at the time, Johnson suffered from Tonkin Gulfitis. He was not going to make another commitment to another state in the region or to another, any possible foreign policy. Johnson, the British, others tried all sorts of negotiations in the last weeks of May and early June of 1967. Johnson, on the tapes, you can hear him at one point tell Senator Fulbright that, you know, we tried. I told him, if you go alone, you won't be alone unless you go alone, which was the mantra of the time, that Israel was not alone, that the United States and others backed her in her demands, at least for free passage through the Gulf of Aqaba. Instead, of course, Israel does launch the Six-Day War. Nasser accuses the United States of having ships and planes involved in the invasion, which Johnson and others see as part of the lies, and certainly is an angry response. In fact, the United States had a ship in the region, the USS Liberty, which was actually bombed by the Israelis during the Six-Day War. If you go on the internet, you'll find still many people still believe it was intentional. The studies or others seem to indicate it was an accident, fog of war, but it was that was what happened. Actually, a direct military issue for the United States at the time. What the Six-Day War does do, though, is I think, if you think of the context of the Six-Day War, the United States is bogged down in stalemate in Vietnam. In fact, it's an increasingly unpopular war, producing all sorts of doubts about American leadership, American power in the world. And here, an American ally, or at least, if not a de jure ally, a de facto ally, defeats Soviet-armed countries in 6 days. This led to a great deal of, I think, enthusiasm, happiness that could not be openly expressed by American officials. We finally won one. We won one, not only won, but in an overwhelming way defeated Soviet clients. And I think for a time, the Six-Day War began to cement more deeply ties between the United States and Israel. In particular, the United States, Johnson does go ahead with the UN, the famous UN resolution that calls for a trade of land for peace, but it's very carefully worded so that it's not, it doesn't call for all the lands to be returned, and it's in some ways allows for some ambiguity. The result is that at the end of the Johnson administration, the United States is seen as far more directly and sympathetically attached to Israel. In fact, it's often occurred to me, and I'll throw this idea out, and I'd be curious if some of you know, that were we to have a political assassination similar to Robert Kennedy's in 1968, committed by a Palestinian, unhappy Palestinian, we would almost immediately have assumed that it was an act of terrorism and not a sort of madman, a loner type of thing. But in 1968, that was still seen as an outlier. Why would someone kill an American politician over Israel, especially Kennedy? Yes?
How is it that we were seen as being more aligned when what kind of aid? Israel supposedly went on its own. We were bogged down elsewhere. So what was it that we did that
We were supplying, we had supplied Hawk missiles, we had supplied armaments to Israel. Our diplomatic posture was that Israel was the aggrieved party. We supported Israel's claims that it had right to passage of the Gulf of Aqaba. There was a lot, in that sense, even if there was not the level of military aid that would come after 1967. Remember, until 1967, the chief arms supplier of Israel is France. It would only come, the break with France would come over the Six-Day War and Charles de Gaulle's antagonism toward France. But the United States was seen as sympathetic. And certainly the fact that Egypt, Syria, not Jordan particularly, but Egypt and Syria particularly were fighting with Soviet weapons made it a Cold War issue of that sort. So even so, the United States, though not directly involved in the Six-Day War, was nevertheless implicated. And certainly when Johnson meets with Kosygin, only about a month, less than a month after the war, Kosygin attacks American policy in the Middle East, attacks Israel, and Johnson, of course, tells President Eisenhower in a tape that he thinks Kosygin has to do that since they failed so miserably in the Middle East, since their weapons, everything, that they've had a terrible failure there. So they have to find someone to blame, and they come to blame the United States on it. The Nixon administration, of course, is more identified in its early years with having to deal with the Vietnam War, Soviet Union, China. And in the first 4 years of the Nixon administration, the Middle East is not the center of diplomatic activity. Now, why can I say that so strongly? Because it's not in Henry Kissinger's portfolio. Basically, what Nixon does is he gives the Middle East to the State Department under William Rogers, who he then proceeds to ignore for this time. It's in a sense shuttled off to Rogers to deal with. Rogers does come up with some plans, and in fact, during the Nixon years, there are a number of disengagement plans, there are a number of plans put forward, but Henry Kissinger himself is preoccupied with other grand politics, and most of his time is spent criticizing Rogers' proposals rather than actually trying to see them implemented. War continues in the Middle East in this period. There's a war of attrition between Egypt and Israel. There are almost 20 to 40,000 Soviet soldiers, airmen, advisors. There's a huge Soviet presence in the Middle East at this time in Egypt. In fact, in the period after the end of the Soviet Union, there have been a great number of reunions of these people where historians have been able to talk to them and get sort of memories that the Soviets were a heavy presence in Egypt at this time. And they had been brought in by Nasser as a part of this sort of effort to project Soviet power. So there were real fears in the White House that there could be a Cold War confrontation, but it was not the preeminent issue. There were crises, and certainly some of them are known to you. The Jordanian Civil War, terrorism, of course, is epic during this time. Iran is armed and strengthened by Nixon as a part of the Nixon Doctrine. In the Middle East itself, though, and I think this is the time. I have one of the things I've done in my Middle Eastern course, and it goes back to the quotation I read you from Wedgwood, is to occasionally show the students elements from the evening news. Vanderbilt has this extraordinary collection of the evening news since August 5th of 1968. So I have clips on Middle Eastern issues and get them to try to imagine seeing them at the time. So one of the clips, the clip I want to show you today, which I hope will project in that, is from the, let's see. Okay. This is from September of 1970. Gamal Abdel Nasser has just died. And this has thrown everything into huge uncertainty. When you watch this, though, think about the sort of ways in which it reflects on the sort of different characterizations of Israel, Egypt, and the world. So let me hope that it shows.
Good evening. People around the world, from heads of state to weeping Arab peasants dressed in black, mourn today The greatest grief is in Cairo, where Nasser died yesterday at the age of 52. Bob Allison reports.
They've been standing here all night in front of Koba Palace, where Nasser's body lies in state. We expect they'll be standing here until Thursday, when the funeral takes place. As you can tell, there are thousands of them. Before it's over, there'll be hundreds of thousands. They brought newspapers with pictures of Nasser, the last pictures ever taken of him, as he was bidding goodbye to the Arab leaders who had come here for the summit. We've seen dozens of women who are completely hysterical. We've seen old men who are crying. We've seen young men crying. We've seen little boys crying. The defeat of Egypt in the June War 1967 didn't mean this much to the Egyptian people. I don't know when I've ever seen such an outpouring of emotion and grief here. Many of them felt that Nasser would never die. He had been here so long, 18 years, and now he's gone. Suddenly, there was no warning, no illness. The great danger on these occasions is that the crowd will break through the police barricade. This often happens, and when they do, they run wild. The Arabs find it difficult to control their emotions on occasions like this. Besides grief, you can see distress on the face of many, and also fear. They have no idea who is going to take Nasser's place. There is no number 2 man here in Cairo. There was only number 1, and he's gone now.
Egypt's major adversary has been Israel, and we have reports on reaction there from Robert Shackney and Larry Pomeroy. First, Shackney.
There were no mourners in the streets of Tel Aviv when the newspaper extras announced the death of Gamal Abdel Nasser. But there wasn't any cheering either, just an intense concern. His death was the only topic of conversation. By morning, Israelis were going about their normal business. The reaction was mixed, a kind of mass crossing of fingers. No one really sure that things would get really better. The former chief of Israeli intelligence, General Chaim Herzog, has studied the question of an Egypt after Nasser.
General, what do you think, on your first reaction, what do you think will be the results of the death of Nasser?
Well, there'll be a period of transition with a lot of jockeying for power in Egypt, and I would say that the main element in the jockeying for power today in Egypt will be the Russians, because they have the most to lose. After all, they have their main Mediterranean base there, and they will doubtless be very active.
Well, Nasser is succeeded by Anwar Sadat, the vice president. Will he in effect be the effective ruler of Egypt, or will it be someone else?
And I don't think he will be in the long run, or he may be now for the transition. But he is lackluster and a weak man, he's not a very strong man. And he's certainly not one of the Russians' man. The Russians have their man there, that's Ali Sabri. There are not many pretenders to the throne there. Who knows, perhaps another Nasser will come out, another Colonel Nasser will come out of the ranks of the army. But it seems to me that the alternatives lie today between Sadat, Sabri, and some dark horse from the army.
Death of Nasser sent the thousands of Arabs in the Israeli-occupied territories into mourning. The Egyptian president had been the traditional champion of the Palestinian cause, and his death left them bewildered and shocked. Demonstrations of mourning were held throughout the captured Arab lands. In East Jerusalem, the city Nasser had vowed to return to the Arab world, families poured into the streets. The magic name of Nasser was heard in every wail and chant. Nasser was as much a hero to Arab youngsters as he was to his own generation, and it was feared the emotion of the East Jerusalem children would boil over into violence. The occupation authorities expected demonstrations, and extra police units were ordered into the holy city. But the threat of riots never materialized. Disorderly incidents were sporadic. The period of mourning will continue for another 2 days in the occupied areas, where was Nasser who brought unity to the Arab world and led it through war and peace. And even for the people who became victims of the 1967 war, the Arabs in Israel's occupied territories, Nasser remained their source of hope in the Middle East. He promised to win back the captured lands and reunite them with their brothers. Now that he is dead, they feel forsaken and uncertain. There will ever again be another Nasser in the Middle East. Larry Pomeroy, CBS News, East Jerusalem.
President Nixon has named Health, Education, and Welfare Secretary Elliot Richardson to head the U.S. delegation at Nasser's funeral on Thursday. Mr. Nixon's next stop on his European tour is Yugoslavia, and Yugoslav President Tito has decided not to go to the funeral in order to meet with Mr. Nixon. Tito will send his top aide to the service. Dignitaries have already begun to arrive in Cairo, and Soviet Premier Kosygin was among the first, weeping as he stepped from the plane.
I show that in part to give you some idea. What do you think Americans of 1970 might have reacted? How would they have seen the Middle East and seeing that filter? Any thoughts on that? Any reactions from your, in terms of how it's done? Yes?
I was a naval aviator at the time, in and out of Vietnam. And when we saw the military guys saw the photos, the movies of what Israel Air Force had done to Egyptian Air Force, we were stunned. It was wonderful.
Yeah.
Absolutely wonderful.
No, I agree. The interesting thing is seeing this is remembering, of course, that the portrayal of Israel and Egypt, you might say Israel, the sort of rational state, concerned, obvious ally against the Soviets, versus Egypt. Yes? Well, that's right. That's right. Although I think, of course, we might identify, but in this, what you see is, of course, the idea that the Arabs can't control their emotions. They're subject to hysteria. They're crazed, in a sense. And I think in a way, although the evidence is not overwhelming from the TV archive, I've got about 4 or 5 clips that sort of reflect this. There is a sort of conscious distancing to the Arabs very clearly in the early coverage of the Middle East. Makes it clear most Americans not only sympathized with Israel, but had a very strong sense that the Arabs were pro-Soviet, not a stable group to rely on, not some place to be courted, and that their claims and their legitimacy of their claims, of course, was questionable. Not surprisingly, of course, terrorism plays a role in this. This, of course, is the famous picture from the Munich Olympics. I have some clips in the collection, and one of the ones that I use sometimes with the students is a clip that portrays one of the Israeli athletes who's killed is American, or came from the United States originally. And his funeral and the sort of connection to the United States is played out on the news, and it's very much, I think, the threat of terrorism and the actions of terrorists were also part of how we saw the Middle East, and certainly how we saw the legitimacy or lack of legitimacy of Palestinian claims. And this was part of this time. Yeah, Bill.
Well, one of the things I found fascinating about the funeral, first of all, is the funeral itself.
Yeah.
Overwhelming crowd. But also in the American press, Nasser was talked about as the great martyr. There's that full circle that comes from the earlier 60s to 1970s, and he's seen actually as a moderating influence in the Arab world compared to other people who are coming.
The fear of who might come after him.
Well, that reminded me of when de Gaulle left. And people, we're always concerned when a strong leader dies, because what may come is...
What may come next? Yes.
And it's always going to be worse.
Always going to be worse. And, you know, in the case, Chaim Herzog, I'm sure, would not want to have that interview replayed, since he so clearly predicted what was going to happen. But this is the other aspect of just not recognizing. And, of course, Sadat was not taken terribly seriously by the Americans and by the Nixon administration, which did not think that he was a serious figure. And it would only be after the Yom Kippur War, when Kissinger went to begin shuttle diplomacy, that Sadat was then seen as a key figure. In fact, the Shah was far more significant for American thinking. And the point of connection here, and I put up the notion of the Nixon Doctrine, and this is something I think that even connects to our own day, is that Nixon, coming into office at a time when Americans had grown tired of military commitments, interventions, wanted to retract the American military presence. And if you want to retract the military presence, you've got to come up, either you have to accept the consequences or you have to come up with some other solution. And the other solution was that Nixon was the notion of having clients, states, who would defend our interests. And one of the principal client states to defend our interests was the Shah. And on his way back from Moscow, after signing the SALT agreement in May of 1972, Nixon stops to see the Shah. And they authorize an enormous expansion in American arms sales to the Shah. And this is the beginning, you might say. The Shah had already begun to benefit from increasing oil prices. Those prices would, of course, spike a year later at the oil boycott. But he would spend a large portion on that on weaponry, including, with another connection to today, the beginnings of a nuclear program, which they also began under the Shah. The idea was Iran would be the power defending American interests in the region. The Nixon Doctrine, in that sense, would see Iran as a defender, but also Nixon also came to see Israel as a strategic asset in the region. It was not just Iran, it was also Israel. And even though Nixon, as many of you know from hearing reports about the tapes, was not exactly fond of the Jewish people, Nixon came to have enormous respect for Israeli military, Israeli armaments, or the Israeli drive, and so was willing, in effect, to also see Israel as key to stability in the Middle East. I have a few minutes. I'm going to just go a little bit over, and then I'll stop at about 12:05 and have about 10 minutes for questions. I'm not going to finish completely today, but I'll leave us at, you might say, the point, one of my favorite points, which is Henry Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy. In October of 1973, of course, Saud, in his determination in a way to finally drive some type of settlement, in a coordinated attack with Syria, launches that attack in October of 1973 against Israel. It is interesting to read in the documents that have been released how the initial response of the United States. Nixon, by this time, was suffering under the weight of Watergate and was not as attentive to issues of foreign policy. Kissinger dealt with most of them. And what they expected was Israel would win quickly, and this would not be a major issue. They were stunned, in a sense, by the early military successes of Israel and Egypt. Those successes terrified Israel. And what you've got to remember in this period is that the Nixon administration had come to the conclusion that the Israelis had nuclear weapons. They understood that Israel had a nuclear deterrent and that under certain circumstances Israel would use it. In fact, there's a great quotation from Henry Kissinger at some point writing a memo to the president that was only declassified the last few years, saying of all states that acquire a nuclear weapon, Israel is probably one of the few that would actually see using it to maintain its existence. In effect, the United States finds itself in a situation where, as Israel suffers losses in the early part of the Yom Kippur War, Kissinger, who had hoped not to launch a massive resupply, had hoped that the war would be over quickly, decides, in effect, with Nixon's approval, to move ahead with a massive resupply of Israel. And the war becomes, in a sense, another proxy war, as the Soviet Union sends weapons to Egypt and Syria, the United States sending weapons to Israel. The tide of battle turns. The Israelis trap the Egyptian army on the other side of the Sinai. Kissinger goes over to Moscow to try to arrange a ceasefire. There are difficulties in the negotiations. At one point, the Soviet Union, if Israel does not accept a ceasefire, threatens to unilaterally intervene. Kissinger, probably with Nixon's approval, although this happened at the same time as the famous Halloween massacre, where Nixon had fired the special prosecutor, and the first cries for impeachment had come. Some of the tapes indicate Nixon might have been under the weather that evening. But Kissinger, in effect, authorizes a nuclear alert. to show the Soviets we are serious. If you try to go into the Middle East unilaterally, we will respond. And so there is, at least for a 24-hour period, about a superpower crisis, not unlike, although not as tense and not as prolonged as the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. However, in effect, Kissinger is able to come out of this with an enormous capital in terms of trying to negotiate disengagements in the Middle East. And over the course of the next year and a half, Kissinger will establish himself as the preeminent celebrity diplomat in a series of agreements with Egypt and Syria and Israel, leading to disengagements, many of which disengagements, especially with Syria and the Golan Heights, last till this day, since there's never been a final agreement with Syria. But in the case of Egypt, he begins the process of flipping Egypt from Soviet ally in the Cold War to American ally in the Cold War. But he also begins the process, and here's where I'll stop today and I'll pick up, begins the process by which the United States would become the arbiter of the Middle East. America is seeing the Middle East as the country that can deliver Israel. So its significance, its importance in the Middle East, as Kissinger carries out his negotiations, as they will then go to Carter and then further into the Reagan, Bush, Clinton years, the United States takes on the central responsibility for trying to manage, police, and negotiate arrangements in the Middle East. The Soviets still wanted to have a role, and in fact, at various points, tried to get into the negotiations, tried to play a part in it. But Kissinger, in effect, begins to exclude them and is able to, with the acquiescence of all the strong men of the Middle East, Saud of Egypt, Assad of Syria, Hussein of Jordan, and begin the process by which the United States tries to carve together a stable Middle East. Now, it's not a democratic Middle East. It's not it doesn't have any resemblance to some of the issues we've talked about in the Arab Spring, but it is the idea of the United States playing the central role that will remain up through and into the present day. So let me stop there and just ask for questions, because what I'll do is next time I'll take us from the 70s up to today. Questions about anything I've talked about? Yes? Okay. Yeah.
I was, I think, a sophomore, maybe a junior in high school during the Hungarian intervention by Russia, and I, at that time, and still don't understand why we did not try to help them.
Well, that answer is probably the easiest way to answer that is the fear of nuclear war. It was perceived that the Soviet Union considered its control over Eastern Europe a vital national interest, and that if that control were challenged, that it would be willing to use nuclear weapons, and particularly against our allies in Europe. We had a lot of men in Germany. We had a lot of, we were physically quite there. And the Eisenhower view was that Hungary was not worth a nuclear war, and that this was the Soviets considered it a vital interest. To get back further, Eisenhower, of course, had campaigned in part on the idea of rollback, the idea that the Truman administration had, as I think it was Richard Nixon who called Dean Acheson, Truman's Secretary of State, the dean of the cowardly college of communist containment. One of those wonderful alliterations. The idea being they would take a more aggressive policy. They would act more aggressively. In fact, when Eisenhower came in and there was a revolt in East Germany, the United States stood by. And then it would stand by in Hungary. It was perceived these were vital interests to the Soviet Union. On the contrary, what Eisenhower was willing to do was to use the CIA to try to upset the Soviet Union in other parts of the world. And he saw Iran and Guatemala, for example, as places where the communists were trying to make gains, and he would overthrow those dictators or rulers, democratic rulers in the case of Guatemala, as a way of trying to set back the Soviets, but not in the area where they considered a vital national interest. Yes?
Did Nasser die of natural causes?
Yes. He had something akin to, I think, a stroke, sudden and massive. And he was only 52. His stroke, the stroke came at the time Nasser had been trying to bring the Arabs together, because it came right after the Jordanian Civil War, in which King Hussein had expelled the Palestine Liberation Organization. And there had actually been a danger that Syria and Iraq were going to intervene on behalf of the PLO in Jordan, and there were all sorts of crises, conflicts within the world. And Nasser had brought all the Arab leaders to Cairo to try to settle it. Nasser was still the character, and I think the TV bit made it clear, he was still seen as the preeminent Arab leader. But he was the only one with that sort of prestige, and he had been doing that. But then, as it makes clear, shockingly died at age 52. Yes?
In the news accounts where they talk about there had never been anyone like Nasser, there never maybe would be again, can you speak to why there has not been a preeminent Arab leader of that sort?
That's a really good question. I guess it forces me to think for a second. I think Saddam Hussein wanted to be. I mean, I think in many respects he hoped to take that role at the time of the Gulf War, sort of being the key figure. Anwar Sadat deliberately pulled away from it. King Hussein was never interested, and Assad was never interested. So I guess the circumstances allowed Egypt to play a particular role because of its size and dominance in the Arab world. It was the place, so it would have required an Egyptian leader. And in effect, Sadat chose a different path, paid for it with his life, and then Mubarak decided to split the difference, in effect saying, I won't be as prominent as Sadat in reconciliation, but I'm not going to be like Nasser in public statement. And that left a vacuum for Hussein. Yeah. Gaddafi may have wanted it too.
Himself as taking his place too, but
yeah.
At that time, 3.5 million people, and a much more mercurial personality.
Well, yeah, another way of saying he was a little more nutty. Yeah.
Arabs actually never took Gaddafi seriously.
Right.
We took him much more seriously than any of the Arab leaders, because they just kind of looked like this guy's nuts.
Yeah. Well, they were right, but I mean, yeah.
I remember a little foggy, but 1972, I know we had like 30 cents a gallon gas.
Right.
And going into 73 is when the hike started. I've always heard it was something to do with this war.
Right. I'm sorry, I did not. I was in summing. It's one of the dangers of trying to consolidate a course of lectures into a presentation. But the Arab oil embargo, of course, one of the things that happened as a result of the United States' decision to resupply Israel was that the Saudis organized a boycott of the United States. And that boycott would last for about 6 months, and it would send oil prices up about 400%. And that would be the beginning of a process by which the oil weapon was seen as so central. And that had to do with, what it had to do with, in effect, was the fact that the United States had for the longest time been the OPEC of the world. We had produced enough oil to take care of our needs and others. The Arabs actually launched an embargo on sales in 1967. Just didn't have any effect because there was plenty of oil out there. So they weren't able to, it didn't have the same impact. But what happened is as the industrial world had sort of developed and grown, the demands for oil had become so great, and the shortage and shortfall in American production had begun, that now the Saudis had a much stronger position, and that they chose to exercise it in this case. Yeah.
I exercised this morning at Diana Center, and I looked out the window, and I saw that there, beneath me, there was a stanchion for people that, for example, have the Chevy Volt. We're using that to sustain their batteries. Now, eventually, oil, if this continues,
Yes.
it will.
What would that mean? That's a good question. That's a good question. I tend not to think it's going to happen in a way that will stop. I mean, because even if there are other uses for oil, there are also countries like India and China that are modernizing, that have shot up the demand as well. Brazil, although it has a lot of its own oil. But essentially, development would probably still make oil valuable. But, you know, in a sense, this is both it's also the strength and the curse of the oil. It provides great wealth, but they have to know what to do with it. I mean, the only country, it seems to me, that really has known what to do with its oil was Norway, which has put it in this fund and sort of invests it and all of this sort of stuff, very careful with it. It'll be interesting to see what happens. Yeah.
I had a very good friend who had very strong Israeli connections, and as after, I believe, the Yom Kippur War, his friend from Israel told him that the Soviet tanks that they captured in Sinai were equipped for fighting in northern Europe. They had heaters in them, they had axes to cut through ice. You know, they weren't prepared for desert warfare. They didn't have any way to fight.
This would not surprise me that they weren't. I mean, they still were able to cross the Sinai. They still caught the Israelis in a situation like that. But the Soviets, for a number of reasons, never fully mastered, I think, the art of creating a stronger military presence and the use of their weapons among the Arab armies. Now, they blame the Arabs all the time, but I think that there's plenty of blame to go around. I don't know, are we at 12:15? I guess we're almost there. One more question or any? Okay, thank you. I'll catch up next time. Thank you.